Most welcome. Thank you, everybody. I'm really glad to be here. It's such a beautiful day, and we have a big agenda for today. I don't know how much of it we'll manage to do within the less than 1 hour in which I want to talk to you. I want to tell you some about the work we've been doing in Israel. I'm an Israeli. I've been an activist in the Israeli peace movement, or peace and justice movement, or anti-occupation movement, or democracy movement, whatever you want to call it. And I want to tell you a little bit about this project, Who Profits from the Occupation, and our research and the results of that research, and who really profits from the occupation. You know, it's a question, so I want to give you some answers. And I also want to tell you about some of the campaigns that sprung out of this attempt to look for the profiteers, some campaigns around the world, and where did they lead and what did they result in. So you'll have some kind of an idea of this global movement that has sprung in the last 3 or 4 years. And we've been hearing about it. This is a movement that's called the Boycott-Divestment-Sanctions movement, BDS, Boycott-Divestment-Sanctions. So it's a lot. And I will just start chronologically, telling you a little bit about how I got to be doing this work. And whatever I won't manage to cover now, you can ask me about later. We'll have time for Q&A, if that's okay with you. So Israel-Palestine. This is a map of Israel-Palestine. It's one country. It has 2 names. It's a very, very common misconception. This is an enlarged map of the West Bank, which is here. And most of the time today I will be talking about the West Bank, for the obvious reason that as an Israeli I cannot even go into Gaza. It's completely closed to Israelis. So almost all of the research we have done was done in the West Bank. And if you look at this map, you see these yellow-brown patches. These are Palestinian population centers. And then there are the darker parts, which are urban areas. And the blue patches, which are Israeli settlements, Israeli population living in the West Bank, which is in an area which is not considered even by Israel to be part of the state of Israel. Israel has not annexed it. It is under military rule, and the sovereign in this part is the Israeli military. So as you can see, the map is very elaborate and intricate, and I'm sure you've seen it and heard about it before. I'm going to assume it today. But this is a map, which is a geographical map that also has economic implications. And we will try also to read the economic implications of such a map, which is so intricate today. So where does it start for me? For me, I've been involved in the movement since the 1990s, but the turning point, I think, for me and for many others in my generation, in my movement, the anti-occupation movement, in my case also the feminist anti-occupation movement or the women's peace movement, we had all these names throughout our existence. The turning point was with the anti-wall campaign. Israel has started building a wall in the West Bank in 2003. And when the wall started to be being built, we didn't know where it was going to be. There were no official maps, there were no public maps. We just heard from people along the route of the wall that their land is being confiscated, that the wall was being built and separating them from the next village, you know, not where we thought it was going to be built. It was very odd, and we didn't know what to make of it. And very quickly, in 2003, sprung from out of nowhere, from these villages along the route of the wall, the anti-wall movement. Okay, we hear a lot of anti-war movements. It's the anti-wall, W-A-L-L. And the anti-war movement had several characteristics that remained with it until today, and it keeps on going until today. One of the characteristics is very grassroots oriented. It's very much non-partisan, which is extraordinary in the Palestinian political map. If you know a little bit about it, it's quite extraordinary. Another thing is that they have embraced non-violence, even in the Gandhian sense. In some cases, even the Gandhian sense. And these days there is I think the 5th Bil'in non-violence conference in Bil'in, which is one of these villages that has been protesting regularly against the wall being built on their land. This is one of the first villages that protested Bidu. So this is my proof that I was there. And as you might know, this is some approximation of some part of the wall. As you probably know, non-violence is a code name for a lot of violence. on one side over the other. And in these demonstrations, we had dozens of people who were killed, even though they were protesting non-violently, peacefully. And you saw that picture of women with banners, but what happens next, I don't, this is a talk I used to give in 2005, but this is like old news by now. Everybody have seen it, you've seen the videos, and if not, you should go online and look for them. These demonstrations they are faced with live fire, rubber-coated bullets, tear gas, and all sorts of other measures that are many times deadly. So this was a very quick school for us Israeli activists. For our generation, I think it was the first time that we were actually invited as allies to the Palestinian struggle. And we got this great opportunity and in fact, honor to be invited as allies and to stand with the Palestinians and see the scene for a moment from that direction. And facing our own army, the same militaries that I grew up to see as my protectors, my friends, my family, myself. It's a very crazy situation to see that. It also changed our idea of who we are and what we want to do. I think for many of us in this movement, until those years, we were still very much embedded in the idea that our role as Israeli activists was to change Israeli public opinion. So there was this global movement for justice in Palestine, and the Israelis in this movement, they have a specific role to change Israeli public opinion. Now, I still think that's the case. I believe in that. I just think this is really very hard because what was happening in the last few years, as any of you who read the news can see, is a drift to the right in the Israeli political arena and very overt racism and one of the most right-wing governments we've ever had. And it seems like the Israeli public opinion is actually drifting away from us, very clearly. And another thing that happened is it seems that we have lost part of our natural audience. And our natural audience in Israel for many years was the liberal Zionist camp. The people who truly believed in liberal ideals of equality and democracy and a constitution and separation of church and state. And they were very much disturbed by evidence of human rights violations in the West Bank. They were very much torn by the facts on the ground of what it means to hold 3.5 million people under a military occupation. What does it mean in the daily meanings of that? And so for us in the radical left or the anti-occupation movement or whatever, they were our natural audience. They were also our protective blanket because there was this very widespread idea that Israel is a democracy and should be a democracy, which usually means in the Israeli public sphere that there are a lot of civil liberties to people who come from where I come from, to Israeli Jews, Ashkenazi Jews, mainly from the center of the country. There are things that I can do that a Mizrahi activist cannot do. It's not by law, it's just something very similar to what you have in this country when you compare people of different ethnicities and their ways of dealing with the state or what they cannot do. And when it came to Palestinians in the occupied territories, they are kind of on the last rung of this ladder, and they have no rights at all, no civil rights whatsoever. You cannot demonstrate. There is no legal demonstration in the West Bank. So that's why I'm saying that the liberal Zionists were kind of our protective blanket because they didn't want to see people who look like them being attacked by the state with some repressive measures. So the idea of freedom of speech and freedom of press and freedom of association and all of these freedoms were more or less what kept us going in the public sphere in Israel, even when we were not very popular, while as our allies who were not white or not in the center or even worse, Palestinian, did not enjoy the same freedoms. And that was okay. Now, we have lost that centrist, liberal, Zionist a group of people. It's not because they have disappeared. They're still there and I know them and they're doing well. It's just that in the Israeli political sphere, there is very little space that remains for them. The parties that represented them have shrunk to almost nothingness. They were considered irrelevant after the breakdown of the Oslo Accord. There are all these crises that happened that made them disappear from the mainstream political sphere. And that also influenced the movement on our side, because it meant that our natural audience was no longer there, and our natural safety net was no longer there, which meant that we were more and more exposed to the same measures used by the state against Palestinians. Arbitrary interrogations by the the General Security Services, the Shabak. Arbitrary arrests and breaking into our offices to take computers. Things like that did happen before, but not as often, and not in the center of Tel Aviv, and not to people of white ethnicities. So that's probably what was going on for us, for people around me, between 2000 and 2007 or so. So that's part of the same process where we found ourselves actually being useful in this movement, even though this was not an Israeli movement. It was a Palestinian-led movement, where the internationals came as solidarity activists. We couldn't call ourselves solidarity activists. We are Israelis trying to change our own country. It's not really solidarity. It's a lot deeper than that. But still, it's not our movement. We cannot make decisions. We cannot lead this movement. It's a Palestinian movement. And we have all the privileges in this area, in the West Bank, that Palestinians do not have, like freedom of movement, which is a huge privilege, that make it easier for us to take over. So trying not to take over was also a very important lesson for us to learn. What does it mean to work with others and remember that this is not your movement, but still be there with all your political ideology and beliefs? How do you do that? What happens if there are conflicts? It's very, very complicated and interesting. Anyhow, this movement is a very appealing movement. If you haven't seen more about what people do in these different villages, you should just go online and go to any of the websites that cover this. Start with the anti-wall website, antiwall.org or something like that. And just see the immense creativity and power and energy in this movement. Every week you have 3, 4, 5 demonstrations. This is all in Bil'in. And they're all nonviolent. They're always ending not so well, but they're always restarting again. And the repressive measures used by the state have escalated over the years from shooting and killing demonstrators. Now it's also night raids and arbitrary arrests of kids from the villages where the demonstrations are being held in order to interrogate them. I'm sorry, I'm like digressing, but I think it's an important story. Once in a while we go to Ofer prison, which is a prison in the West Bank where many of the political prisoners are being held. And it is also a military courtroom, Ofer. So we sit there in the children's courtroom. There is a courtroom which is specifically for underage prisoners. And just sitting there for a day, every month, is a school that you need to do, because when I live in Tel Aviv, just like when you live in Portland, it's so easy to forget what the occupation is like. It's so easy. You know, you go to your cafe, you just forget. You don't want to remember that, you don't need to remember that, and you forget. And so sitting in that children's courtroom and seeing how these 14, 15-year-olds are brought shackled in brown trainings, and then held there and interrogated in front of a military judge and a military prosecutor wearing Israeli army uniforms. Did these people tell you to go to the demonstration? In other words, they are asked to point who are the organizers of demonstrations in their village. And they were arrested the week before in the middle of the night at gunpoint, and haven't seen anyone, not a lawyer, not their family, not anyone since then. So you have 14-year-old held in a not very nice military prison for a whole week in order to come to court and testify that somebody has invited them to a demonstration. And this is a daily occurrence, because then the demonstration organizers are put in prison indefinitely, sometimes under administrative detention. Sometimes one of the organizers in Bil'in, for example, was put in prison because he was charged with telling people to throw stones, even though he is a non-violent organizer. So obviously he didn't tell people to throw stones, but that's what they could show up. I'm just telling you how it goes. Another thing about these demonstrations, apart from the fact that they are very empowering for the participants, they're also very scary, as you can imagine. And if any of you have ever tasted some good, strong tear gas, they're also very unpleasant. My experience of these demonstrations in the first few years was it was so empowering, you know, to be part of this popular movement and to actually be part of something bigger than me that I agree with and I identify with and actually embraces me. Because when we did demonstrations against the occupation or against the wall inside Tel Aviv, usually people around me were not that embracing. So I was so used to women in black in Tel Aviv standing, stop the occupation, and being shouted and spat at, and you know. But this is a very different experience, you know, marching with the village, with everybody. And so it was very empowering. But after a year or two, it also became very, very, very scary. And my experience was getting to the demonstration. We don't even start marching. The army attacks the village, you know, sprays everybody with stink water and tear gas and shooting in the area, and you don't know where they're shooting from. And I'm not a soldier anymore. I don't want to be a soldier. I don't want to know where they start shooting from. So the idea is you hide, or you run for your life, and then you hide somewhere. And I find myself in some animal shed talking to the goat. So that's my experience. So the idea was, okay, I stay home today. I won't go to the demonstration. I will feel very guilty. I don't know if you know the economy of guilt of the solidarity activists, yes? That's another type of economy. So I feel very guilty because my friends are out there and it's dangerous, and how can I help? So we need to find another way to do direct action and support the causes we believe in when we cannot go to the demonstration. So this is how we got to research. And this is not a joke. This is actually how we got to be doing research, because I was doing research in my academic life. And I said, hey, they are shooting these terrible things at us. Who is making them? So this is a canister that was actually shot at me. This is personal. This is on my kitchen table. And it says CTS. So you go and you check, what is CTS? It's an American company. It's called Combined Systems Incorporated. This is a company that actually tripled their revenues in the last 4 years because of all the uprisings around the world. Everybody is buying their tear gas materials. They are doing great business. There was a whole shipload of their tear gas canisters that was halted for a whole day by the Egyptian resistance. They were sent in as a special delivery from the US to help the Egyptian government or the Egyptian army. Okay, so that's the kind of business they do. They were actually started by two Israelis that moved to Pennsylvania, I think, and started this company. And I wanted to ask you like a kind of a question. Why would Israelis move to the US to start a company in order to sell weapons to Israel? What's the logic of that? Yeah.
US gives the money to US companies. The military aid actually goes to US.
Yeah. So yeah, you don't get to answer any more questions because I think you know. That's it. That was your last one. So, but you get the point there. So the US gives Israel the US military aid. So it's something like $3 billion a year. Most of it stays here. Most of it is a subsidy to the military-industrial complex over here. So in many cases, Israeli weapons companies, they start a subsidiary in the US in order to win contracts with the Israeli army. Because for the Israeli army, it's much easier to give these contracts to American companies. It's cheaper because they don't pay for it. The US government will pay for it. You guys will pay for it. So you should know that. So this is one of these companies, very successful company. Another thing is, if you heard about the struggles of Bil'in, this is Bil'in, that village that has been demonstrating, I think now for 6 years, I don't know, forever, every Friday. They are protesting because of the wall, which is built here, on their lands, separating them from their land. It was actually even recognized by the Israeli Supreme Court that they have a just claim. And one way, if you don't join the demonstration, is to try and find out what's happening on this side of the wall. Why is it there? Why did they build a wall there? Why did they have to take these people's land? It's farmers' farmland, yes? And the answer is that these things are being built there. These are construction sites at the time of new neighborhoods in a settlement called Modi'in Illit. And they were not even built yet. This was just land taken for the future expansion of the settlement. So one question was, okay, who is building this? Make sense? So that was actually a very hard question because it was a company that was registered through all sorts of tax havens in all sorts of weird places, huge wild goose chase. But the company itself is registered in Canada. Let me just show you that's the wall, by the way. That's the wall. So it's registered in Canada. So these are two Canadian companies that build a part of Matityahu East on Buil-In's lands. One is called Green Park and one is called Green Mount. Something good is happening there. Maybe you should choose to go there. That meant that the people of Buil-In could file a lawsuit against the Canadian companies in Quebec, Canada. Because unlike in Israel, Canada does recognize that the settlements are illegal. According to international law, or the Fourth Geneva Convention, that all the signatories of the UN are signatories to it, according to the Fourth Geneva Convention, you cannot move your own population into an area under your military control as an occupier. You cannot do that. You cannot do that. Illegal. So that was debated in the Canadian courts. In the end, this lawsuit was dismissed by the Canadian courts that decided that the construction firms didn't have, they are not responsible for that. Because the responsibility as signatories of the Fourth Geneva Convention is of states. They are the ones who are signatories to that. So it's really in a lot of dispute what is the extent of the accountability of corporations that participate in that economy. But in any case, it was a huge deal that we could actually sue them somewhere. Yes?
Can you repeat what the resolution or
I think it is under some process of appeal, but the original suit was dismissed because it was said that the corporations are not responsible for that crime. There is another company that was involved in the same construction in Matityahu Illit, actually as contractor. And this is when I start telling you a little bit about the campaigns. The company is called Africa Israel. Africa Israel is a huge public construction company in Israel. And it's owned by the richest man in Israel, Lev Levayev, whose name you see on that little plaque. So this is a story about a face-off between the richest man in Israel, who is a personal supporter of settlements, who has another private company owned only by him that built a whole settlement that is private settlement. You know, he really supports settlement. And a small group of activists in New York. This is a small group of activists in New York. It's called Adala New York. Adala in Arabic means justice, so Adala New York, exactly. And what they did, because they know that Lev Levayev built settlements, Lev Levayev has just opened a new diamond store in New York City, in Manhattan. And they were holding a vigil outside the diamond store saying, settlements don't sparkle. You know, they were trying to put together the idea of like settlements is bad, don't buy diamonds here. So they were picketing the stores, and the store had this huge opening, and Suzanne Sarandon came to the opening. The actress, Suzanne Sarandon. So that was a good deed, because she came in, she didn't participate, but she's a celebrity. So you have a celebrity coming in, you can send her a letter, you can ask her to boycott the store, and then suddenly the press is interested. Because there is a celebrity involved somehow. It's the Middle East there, and settlements, and diamonds, and Suzanne Sarandon. So it got into some other pages in the newspaper than the regular pages. What happened? You know, anyone who just reads the news says, oh, it's a bunch of fools. You know, don't they have anything better to do? What do they think? That they will vigil this guy's store, and then what? What will happen? They don't have any power. You know, what can they do? Well, sometimes the planets align themselves. And you cannot tell. You know, you just don't know what is going to happen. In this case, what happened was a financial crisis. And that hit specifically the construction industry and you know, housing projects. And these guys, this guy's assets were mostly invested in big construction projects in Eastern Europe and in Russia. So all of it was kind of stuck and suddenly didn't worth anything. And he was stressed for credit. Another thing that happened in the alignment of the planets, which is not a good thing, but it did happen, Israel has invaded Gaza in December 2008, if you remember. December? No, it was in the summer, 2008. December. Okay.
Yeah, December 29th.
Oh, good. Thank you. December 29th, 2008, Israel invaded Gaza, resulting in 1,400 Palestinians killed and a huge outrage around the world. And governments wanted to show their disdain, and they were looking for things to do. And one of the things that was done was an action by the Norwegian government. We're jumping to another continent. The Norwegians, who have a national pension fund from their oil monies, have decided to divest their investment from this guy's company, Africa Israel. Okay? Why? Because according to their policy, just like, by the way, the US foreign policy, settlements are illegal and are an impediment to peace. So it was a very easy political decision to say we want to do something that shows that we're against expansion of settlements. And then, when they were looking to do something around settlements, there was all this press hoo-ha around this guy and his company and his construction and the demonstrations in Berlin. So they said, oh, okay. If our national pension fund is invested in this guy's company, let's pull this investment. Because we don't want to be invested in profits from settlements which we view as illegal. We don't want to benefit from something we say is a crime. You know, it's about your own consistency. And this is a good timing for them because they wanted to do something at that point. That's what happened. Now, had there not been these demonstrations, they probably would have chosen something else to do. But this time, unfortunately for him, they chose him. And that started a kind of a domino effect because, you know, in a financial crisis, when somebody pulls out from your investment, maybe somebody else will. BlackRock investment divested from Africa, Israel too. It's unclear if it's because of politics or because of the financial crisis and what's happening in Russia. And suddenly this guy was really stressed for credit and he couldn't get any credit anywhere. So his company has filed a press release in Israel saying, Africa Israel is currently not building anything in settlements, nor does it have any plans to do so. However, that does not mean that we will never build in settlements. Something like that, some convoluted press release like that. As far as I know, they have not built anything in settlements ever since. Now that's a huge victory. This is a big.
They own Modi'in-Illit?
No, they don't own Modi'in-Illit. They were just contractors in some of the construction in one of the. But he has another company, privately owned. So it's not public. It's not traded in the stock exchange. It's not exposed to the whims of these investors. That continues building in settlements. So you can see that the guy hasn't changed his politics or his business politics or anything. But he has decided that in his public company, he cannot afford to do so anymore. In fact, looking around settlement construction today, I haven't checked it very thoroughly this year because I was traveling around and I was here mostly. But as far as I know, there are no publicly traded corporations today building in settlements. There is a lot of settlement construction. There is a lot of construction going on. Everything is being built. But none of the constructors are publicly traded companies. And that tells you something. It tells you that you don't need to do much in order to change corporate policies. But sometimes it's the economic sphere that is easier to manipulate for us as a global movement than any of the other spheres. If you cannot influence people's political ideas or ideologies or I don't know, religious ideologies, we can sometimes still change their corporate policies. Because what they care there is only about the bottom line. And the bottom line is very much sensitive to a global movement that can influence consumer, investors, etc. I'll give you a few more examples, but this is just one good victory. When we started Who Profits from the Occupation, it was just a small group of volunteers, and then it grew out to be a kind of a research institute. And the idea was to try and find out more about the economy of the occupation, specifically about corporate interest and corporate stake in the occupation. Because as you know now, I think people are very well aware of it from the Occupy movement, our democracy is not really led by politicians, or not just by politicians. The corporations have a lot of political power. And so if we want to influence anything, we need to know who has a stake in it and who is actually helping what we want to change, helping it remain as it is, helping it solidify and become, you know. And that's one of the things about the occupation of the West Bank, Gaza, Golan Heights. It has been there for many, many decades. And many corporations have a stake in it. And many of them have political power. And if we don't know who is involved, how can we even know who is in the room with us in this discussion? That was the idea of this research. And part of what we did was to flip the charts as they were before. This is one of the charts. This is a chart made by the Alternative Information Center about the costs of the occupation. So there was a lot of discussion about the cost of the occupation, and you must be familiar with such discussions. The cost of the Iraq War, you know, how many libraries can we fund with one F-16? you know these calculations, and the same is true with the occupation. For many years, the peace movement was trying to tell Israelis it's not worthwhile, it's not cost-effective, it's too costly. It's very costly. It's very expensive for us. We should use this money to do better things. You know, that's the kind of... we took the same numbers and we flipped them. And we said, okay, there are all these costs. These are the security costs, by the way. Which means the wall, the bypass roads that allow for settlers to get home without seeing any Palestinian. You know, all these security costs. And the army and so on. This is very costly. Okay? Where does this money go to? Okay? All these costs are costs to the general budget, to the state budget. But that money goes to somewhere. And with increased privatization in the Israeli economy, it mostly goes to corporations. And when it goes to corporations, these are specific groups and interest groups in Israel that now have a stake in it. Okay? So that's the question, who profits? Another one of these charts from the Alternative Information Center, just showing you how the costs are totally growing almost exponentially over the years. And a huge part of it is the security costs. And I can tell you more about it if you ask me to explain why the costs are growing so fast. But one very quick reason, it's not the full reason, but it's one reason, is the huge expansion of settlements. Settlements are very costly to the Israeli economy. In fact, it is said that the welfare state remains in the West Bank in settlements, where it was already totally privatized inside Israel. We can talk more about that. Why is it so much costlier and getting costlier all the time? But that's an important thing for us to know. If the occupation is getting so much costlier, we should know what is sustaining it economically. Because if it continues growing, there might be a point in time when they say, hey, we cannot afford it anymore. So I just want you to keep it in mind. Okay, let's go to the mapping. Different types of profit from the occupation. We did a total mapping, and it's all on our website, whoprofits.org. So you can see we have something like 500 companies listed there, each one with their specific involvement in the occupation. And our sources of information are always primary sources, because we are very careful, because we know we work in not a very friendly environment. So we try and be very, very, very rigorous in our research. So we don't quote newspapers or something. We actually go and look and take pictures and figure out what we can in getting original documents in order to actually prove. We have a little docket about each company. And if something you're looking for is not there, write to us, because we might have it elsewhere. It's very hard work to put things on the website. There is a big library. Maybe something is there. Maybe we'll know whom to ask. Okay? Another thing is that if you see a company that you're interested in, but there isn't enough information there, remember that what we have on the website is just a blurb. You know, it's just a little index. We probably have more information. We have a whole file on them. Ask us. Okay? We have the staff that will try and answer your questions. So one type of profit from the occupation that people usually don't think about is exploitation. When talking about colonial, regimes, people know that there are all these types of exploitations that the colonialists can benefit from. If we start with natural resources, then the West Bank doesn't have oil, it doesn't have gold, it doesn't have diamonds, but whatever there is being plundered. And that means water, I'm not going to talk about water, it's a whole different talk. Land, of course, as you saw, but also stone. Stone for the Israeli construction industry. This is a picture of a stone quarry. There are 13 Israeli stone quarries in the occupied West Bank. Most of their product goes back into Israel for the Israeli construction industry, which is dependent to some part on that supply. This is a non-renewable natural resource. The same fourth Geneva Convention that says that you're not allowed to move your population to an occupied area has a different clause against the stealing of natural resources for your own economic benefit. They have a special name for it. They call it, it's in English, I forget. I will remember, pillage. Pillage, yeah, that's the word, pillage. Sorry about that. Anyhow, we have helped put together the file of an information on these pillagers in order to file it as an appeal to the Supreme Court in Israel. Even though the Supreme Court is officially just about the state of Israel, its realm was extended by a military decree to the West Bank and to the occupation. But this is all an Israeli internal judicial process. And this was debated by the Israeli Supreme Court for over 2 years, the question of the legality of the quarries, the stone quarries. And in the end, which was just a month ago, they came out with a ruling that was so amazing, I think, on so many levels. Because on the one hand, they acknowledged the illegality of these operations. They said, according to international law, this is a problem. You cannot do that. And then they tried to justify it, on the other hand, in order to actually legalize it and to allow the continued operation of these quarries. And they had a list of reasons why they think it's okay. One, they will not allow the expansion or the building of new quarries. So they know it's bad. Secondly, these have been there for decades and it's been a long time. And usually the international law refers to military occupation as something very, very temporary. But the Israeli occupation doesn't seem to be temporary anymore. So, for this, it was really bad. And another reason they gave why it was okay is because many of the people who work in these quarries are Palestinian workers. So this is a way to support the Palestinian economy or the Palestinian by giving them jobs. One would ask, why couldn't they work in a Palestinian quarry and actually pay taxes to the Palestinian Authority and not to the Israeli treasury and make it all legal? I don't know. And why should the product go to Israel that way and not as a form of export from the, it's plundering. But there are many other forms of exploitation. This is, for example, a picture I took by chance. I was driving up from the Jordan Valley through a settlement called Ma'ale Ephraim, which is in a beautiful place overlooking the Jordan Valley underneath, going up to the mountain in the desert. And they have a small industrial zone there, so I couldn't help myself. I drove in and took pictures, and then you take them home and you Google, and you see what you can find about. That's the secret of what we do. No secrets, that's it. That was it. Gave you the secret. So there was this little plaque here, and I went home and I checked it, and that was a huge story that revealed itself from all these legal documents that were online about this place, which is owned by the biggest HMO in Israel, which is the biggest health services provider in Israel, Kupat Cholim Klalit. And this is apparently one of the places where they dump toxic medical waste. You cannot really blame them. They have tried to move into Israel proper for many years. Nobody wants them. All the regional councils that they have applied for was, No way, you're not going to move here. In other words, they are suspected as being highly polluting. And that's another thing that we have noticed about these industrial zones in the occupied territories. There are about 18 industrial zones in the settlements. Of them, only 3 are kind of substantial and have more industry in them. And I think only 1 is somewhat successful, Barkan industrial zone, next to Ariel, which is a big settlement city. But in all of them, the Israeli environmental protections were extended kind of offhandedly. Some things were extended, some things were not. There is regulation, but it is done by the local authority of the settlers and not by the state, because the state is not there. You know, it's out of the state. So we have many, many reports of very severe pollution from these places. Very severe pollution.
Excuse me, these are in the settlements?
Yeah.
On the occupied?
In the West Bank, yes. I don't have the slide here, but one example would be an industrial zone next to Tul Karem in the north, which is called Nitzanei Shalom, which in Hebrew means buds of peace. I wish I had the slide because you should see this place. Oh, here it is. I have the slide. It was just in the wrong order. It's totally surrounded by the wall, the concrete wall on all sides. It's on the Palestinian side of the wall, but it's kind of an extension of it to the Palestinian side. And it holds something like 5 or 6 factories of chemical industry, highly polluting chemical industry. And for example, there is a whole neighborhood of Tul Karem where people actually moved out of their houses because of the water coming out of these plants. It was like, you know, disgusting water killing their trees, and so they decided it wasn't really healthy to be there, and they moved out. There are reports of increased rates of cancer in the city of Tul Karem. These people have been trying to complain for years, but there is no one to complain to. It's kind of like Palestinian land is no man's land. Yes, there is no one to complain to. Whom they will complain to? To the sovereign, which is the Israeli military. The Israeli military sends a letter to the civilian authority of the settlers to go and check the plants. But there is actually no serious state authorities that will go and hold these factories accountable. This is why they're there. They actually moved from within Israel to that area because they couldn't stay within. We have reports from within one of the plants that says that when the wind shifts direction and blows west, they stop production. Now, what's the difference? I mean, it's a very small country. Israel, you know, when you pollute the land here, it's all polluted. When you pollute the water here, it's all polluted. When you pollute, you know, it's like, it's stupid. It's not about pollution. It's about regulation. When the wind blows west, it hits an Israeli town next door, where the people who live there are citizens, protected by the state, who have an environmental protection ministry of the state. They can complain, and it can cost them money. On the other side, on the east, you have other people who live there who are not protected by the state. That's it. And whenever you have such an unequal situation, corporations will come in to exploit it for their profit. That's just what happens. It's called capitalism. Another form of exploitation is exploitation of labor. Again, Israeli labor laws were extended to the settlements, but not in full. It is still much cheaper to employ Palestinian workers in the settlements than it is to employ Israeli workers. There are about 35,000 Palestinian workers working in the settlements, in all sorts of jobs. And we even saw an ad for the Barkan industrial zone, where the director of the industrial zone, I think her name was Tami Alush at the time, she was interviewed, and she was trying to explain to people why they should move their plants to her industrial zone, why it's more, I don't know, profitable, that's the word. And she said, well, you know, first of all, the rent is very cheap. It's about 20% the rent of a next door industrial zone in Rosh Ha'ain, which is really not far from there. Why is the rent very cheap? Why is it cheaper?
Free land?
It's free land. Free land. Nothing cheaper than stolen. It's like you don't get any cheaper than that. But not only that, there are also all these special subsidies that these industrial zones enjoy. They enjoy like Zor Adifut Aleph Aleph, how do I say that in English? Like
Get support from the government.
yeah. So usually this title of a special area for support is given to outposts on the border, very far from the center, where it's really hard to hold industry because it's hard to get the more skilled workers there. It's out of the way. It's very far, you know. In this time, when we're talking about a place like Barkan Industrial Zone, it's on the main road from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. It's in the center. It's like half an hour from the city. They're not really an outpost. So they enjoy these special incentives even though they are not very far from the center. And another thing that she said in that interview, Tami Alush, the director of Barkan Industrial Zone, she said, well, you know, Palestinian workers don't always demand their minimum wages. She actually said that. It's something about their psyche. You know, they are very interesting kind of people. They don't demand their rights. Now, that's actually true. There are some unusual ones that have organized and organized strikes and in Israeli settlements. But usually it's almost impossible to do. And that's because they don't have civil rights, so you cannot have labor rights. You're not allowed to demonstrate. Demonstration is illegal. What do? You're not allowed to organize under a military regime. This is not democracy. You are under a military regime. People forget that sometimes, but this is easy to forget, as I said. It's very easy to forget. So how do you organize? And also, in order to get to these industrial zones, you have to pass a checkpoint. You have to have a special military permit, like a security permit from the Shabak, from the General Security Services. And once you organize anything, doesn't matter what, you lose your security clearance, you lose your job. It's not even your employer who is responsible, it's the security authorities. It's very, very hard to organize. So these are all the types of exploitation that are part of occupation: exploitation of land, exploitation of natural resources, exploitation of workers. There's also exploitation of the Palestinian market. And that's, I don't know how much time we have, I guess nothing. I'll just say that in a sentence. But the Palestinian market is a captive market for Israeli goods. It's totally captive, totally dependent on import and exports through the Israeli ports. This is part of the Oslo Accords. It's called the Paris Protocols of the Oslo Accords that made it so that the Palestinian economy is totally dependent on import, export, staple foods, gas, oil, electricity, everything from the Israelis on the terms of the Israelis. So, for example, the Israeli electricity company supplies most of the electricity in the West Bank at their own rates. It's not a free market economy. In fact, the price for industry for Palestinians is about 3 times the price for industry for Israelis. So it's another way that is used in order to de-develop the Palestinian industry and make sure that it doesn't compete with the Israeli industry because they have cheaper labor. It's called colonialism. It's a very old story. Another example. Israeli cellular companies. They can build their antennas all around the West Bank. Everywhere where it's white here, which is called Area C. Area C is 65% of the West Bank, which is an area under total control, military and civilian, of the Israelis by the Oslo Accords. It is an area where Palestinians are not allowed to build anything, not even a toilet. Okay? So definitely they cannot build a cellular antenna. So all of the Israeli cellular companies, they have antennas, hundreds of them, all around the West Bank. Then you have the green patches here. That's Area B. Area under total security control of the Israelis, but civilian control of the Palestinian Authority. This is area, probably villages, people who live in these areas and they need to use a cell phone because we live in the cell phone culture, yes? And when they want to call from here to here, they have to pay roaming charges to the Israeli company because they don't have, the Palestinian cellular company does not have antennas in there, in between. By the way, these patches in between, these tan patches, this is Area A. This is the area where the Palestinian Authority has security control as well as civilian control. And this is where the Palestinian Authority is, even though the Israelis keep also invading that area. So when people talk to you about Israel versus Palestine, or the Palestinian Authority versus the Israeli state, you have to explain that map to them. This is what it looks like. That's the Palestinian Authority. Okay, that's what we're talking about. So there are all these forms of profit, and when I want to ask who profits from the occupation, I would start and say, well, all the settlements, the companies that are in settlements that exploit Palestinian labor, those who exploit natural resources, obviously, those who use the captive market, the Palestinian captive market for goods. They flood the Palestinian market with Israeli goods because the Palestinians cannot cross checkpoints, so they cannot compete. You know, dairy, for example. The Palestinian dairy industry is in ruin because of the checkpoints. Especially in 2003, 2004, that was a turning point for the dairy industry because of the huge impediment on movement in the West Bank. It just went bad. The dairy went bad, wouldn't cross checkpoints. So they couldn't compete with the large Israeli producer who didn't stop in checkpoints even. So settlements, checkpoints, exploitation, definitely all those companies that make tear gas and special gadgets for the wall, you know. So we can make a list, and we have a list. We have an extensive list online. But let me give you some of the results of our research and jump to the end, because I know it's getting late and I can continue talking forever. One of the reports, if you go to whoprofits.org, we have reports online. I think they are very interesting, but it's just me. One of them is a report about the banking industry. Shows how all of the big banks in Israel are complicit in the occupation. Not complicit because they are banks and they give loans to everybody and they have bank accounts for everybody. Not enough. Not enough. Complicit in the way of actual partnership in construction projects in the settlements. So if you only focus your eyes on settlements because they are illegal, and you only focus your eyes on construction in settlements because everybody thinks it's an impediment to peace, Israeli banks serve as partners in these construction projects. Not just providing loans, but actual partners. Another report that we have is about the wine industry in Israel. We go back here to the idea that Israel-Palestine is actually a very small place. All of the industries, industry by industry, you can see how it's impossible to separate the economy of the occupation from the economy of Israel. They are inseparable. Even if you only focus on settlements. If a service provider chooses not to provide their services in the settlements, in the Israeli frame of mind, they will be described as discriminatory because they discriminate against settlers. So, and also there is a law now against that. There is a law, an anti-boycott law that passed in the Israeli Knesset last year that says that a company that participates in a boycott of the settlements, for example, but not only, but of the settlements, can be made to lose government contracts. The Minister of Finance, I think, can decide not to allow them to participate in any government contracts. That's a huge deal for a small country where the biggest consumer is the state. So for big companies that need state contracts, this is a huge deal. You cannot participate in a boycott of the settlements. In other words, you have to provide your services equally inside the borders of Israel and outside the borders of Israel to settlers, but not to Palestinians in the West Bank. So what happens in effect is a two-tiered economy that is really an apartheid services map, where people live really next door to each other, Palestinians and Israelis in the settlements, but they use different roads, which are also not of the same, of course, quality. They have different laws that govern their lives. They have different ways of appealing or complaining about things that affect their lives, because these are represented by the state and these are not. And they receive different services totally. You know, if you live here, you can order your couch from IKEA inside Israel. But if you live here, you cannot order your couch from IKEA inside Israel. So this is a structural thing that was built over the years, but this is the way it is, and we're trying to explain that to companies who want to do business in Israel and tell them this is what you will have to deal with. How do you maintain your ethical policies in such a case, in such a scenario? And I started saying something about the wine industry just as an example. Our wine report shows how all of the big wineries in Israel use grapes from the occupied area. in an overt way or not. It doesn't matter if some of them publish it and are proud of it, some of them not. And we also try to analyze the reasons why and how did it come to happen. And it seems like it was really easy in the last few years to take over private Palestinian land in the West Bank by planting a lot of vineyards. It's a highly mechanized, I learned a lot about these things for some reason. And it's very easy to process large patches of land without a lot of workers. And it's cheap. And also they got special subsidies for olive groves and for vineyards from the government. And so there are all these areas in the West Bank that are now, if you drive through them, it's like Napa Valley. And they invite you to go wine tasting. They produce a lot of wine grapes. And they are of good quality wine grapes. It's a good wine country, apparently. So there is all these grapes that even if the big wineries didn't want to buy them originally, they were tempted to because they were cheap and they were available, and they started mixing and they started putting it into their wines. And we could go vineyard, winery by winery to show how it was done. So it's really very, very important to remember how small this country is and how central to it is already this whole settlement project. It's really inseparable. And that's my last slide. I'm lying, but that's my last slide. Who profits from the occupation? So that's the answer to the question. Another little fact about the Israeli economy, it's highly centralized. There is a small number of tycoons that control the Israeli economy. Sometimes they are referred to in the Israeli press as the 18 families, because many of them are actual families, biological families, but not all of them. And there are some, 20 families, 10 families, 18 families. It depends what you measure and when. This keeps changing all the time. But it's a highly centralized structure of control, of pyramids of control of the market. And sometimes it is told that Israel is a company town. I read an article in the financial press in Israel about this guy. This was this long, elaborate story about a person who wakes up in the morning and eats breakfast, and then he goes to work, and then he drives his car, and then he goes to the supermarket to buy, and then he goes to the cinema. All these things happen throughout his day. And his entire day, he is involved with transactions with this guy, Nochi Dankner, who is one of the main tycoons in Israel. Because these were all his businesses that he was participating in. There are these brothers, the Ofer brothers, I think one of them just passed away, who control the Dead Sea and the shipping line, ZIM shipping line, national shipping line. Just last year, they have signed a call for a return to negotiation for the Israeli government. A call upon the Israeli government to return to negotiation with the Palestinians and work for peace.
They were the one whose company was selling to Iran, right?
Yes. And that actually came out immediately after they signed that letter for some strange reason. One second, let me finish the story. Yeah. Oh, so I thought one of them passed away. Apparently, both of them. Yeah, so, it's a great love story. But the story was, one second, after they have signed this petition, they were interviewed in the Israeli press and asked, what happened? I mean, you haven't signed any such public appeal in, 20 years. What has changed? Why now? You want to return for negotiations? And I think it was Idan Ofer that said in the interview, well, we don't want Israel to be isolated like South Africa. So the answer was kind of cynical. It wasn't about peace and war and human rights. It was about there are implications. There are repercussions to what we are doing. This is not sustainable. We have to go back to the negotiations and reach some solution. The fear of international isolation. We'll have time for Q&A if it's okay, so I just finish this part, or is it pressing?
Well, just a clarification.
Yeah.
In saying that they control 50% of the stock market, you mean they own 50% of the total market capitalization?
No, control. So that means that they have holding shares in the groups that control other groups. It's pyramids of control. You don't need to own a lot in order to control everything. It's kind of weird. Yeah. So that's another story. This is Lev Levayev, the guy we met earlier. So you understand. So what I'm trying to say is that this is not a huge project. If what we're trying to do, and I think we are, I would love to do that, is to tell the Israeli public something that they don't know, which is this is not sustainable. it's not okay, because now the discourse in Israel is very much about how to manage the conflict, not how to solve it. And we don't have any choice, and we have to continue as we are, and there is no other way ahead, and we'll just sustain it. It's okay. We'll bear it and continue, and actually we can do it. No, you cannot. It is going to become too expensive for you. It's not sustainable. Now, to send that message that it is not sustainable sometimes is as easy as influencing the economic interests of a small group of financial groups. It's not big. It's a small economy. That's another thing. And that's BDS. The Boycott-Divestment-Sanctions movement there are all these misconceptions about it. One misconception is that it's a movement. It's not a movement. There is no top-down leadership or it's a network of different campaigns around the world that are not even coordinated. There are some groups that try and send information from one group to another. They don't have any shared politics. They don't have any shared agenda. They don't have anything. There are all types of responses to a call. The call that came out in July 2005 was a unified call of Palestinian civil society signed by over 170 organizations. And the call was a call to people of conscience around the world, and specifically also to Israelis, to use tools such as boycotts, divestment, sanctions, which are tools of nonviolent non-cooperation on Israel until it complies. That's the word I'm missing. I don't know what's wrong with me today. It's Portland. It complies with international law and international standards of human rights. And there are also the 3 demands that are all rights-based demands. Right of return, end of the occupation, and equal rights for Palestinians. Sorry, I'm not focused. So this is a call. Now you have to realize that the call was signed by women's groups, Muslim groups, youth groups, communist groups, groups that don't agree with each other on anything. They don't have the same vision. People now ask us, is the BDS movement actually a one-state movement? What are you talking about? Talk with the original signatories of the call. Many of them are very much invested in the idea of 2 states, and some of them are one-staters. They don't agree with each other on anything. This is a huge accomplishment that they could sign this call. They have never signed anything together until that moment. So, of course, there is no one political agenda to this movement. Another misconception is that this call is actually a call that asks you to endorse it. You don't need to endorse it. It's not your call. I'm not a Palestinian. They sign the call, that's their call. I cannot agree with it, but I still have to respond to it if I'm a solidarity activist. Because these are the people whose struggle I'm trying to support. This is their liberation that I'm trying to support. And this is what they are calling me to do. I need to respond. And they even say so. There is a Boycott National Committee, and the website is bdsmovement.net, that tries to send out guidelines from Ramallah. Tries. And one of them, it's very clear. We are asking people to take this call and use it locally, in whatever way it makes sense locally. This is not an actual quote. You can read the actual quote there. We're not telling people what to do, and we're not telling them they should endorse the call. Why am I saying that? Because I've been here for a year, and I've been traveling around, and I have seen all these groups that are debating whether or not they endorse the call. We don't care if you endorse the call. If you want to endorse the call, endorse the call. That's okay. This is a call for action. This is a call for action. That's the difference. The difference is not, do we change our thinking about one state? No. This is a call telling us, stop waiting. You're not the president of the United States. Nobody asks you what would you have done if you were the president of the prime minister of Israel. You can do that in your spare time. But what we're asking you to do is to do what you can do as who you are. As a consumer, what does it make sense? What makes sense to do here in Portland? What makes sense to do here in Portland in the way of non-cooperation? Which means we need to figure out in what ways are we cooperating. Here in Portland, what are the different ways in which we support human rights violations in the West Bank? As consumers, as investors. And try and stop that. This is a form of non-cooperation, which means I stop my cooperation with things I don't agree with. It's not a blanket call. It doesn't mean that you have to boycott anything that has to do with, it doesn't make sense. It's not even a consumer alert, you know? It doesn't make sense because all these economies are so intricately woven with each other. The idea is to choose one good local campaign that works for you, that helps us build movements, that helps us educate people around us, that helps us also send a message that says we will not continue cooperating with things we don't agree with, something like that. And of course, that was the last slide, so I'll show you 10 more. One example is the Ahava campaign. I don't know if you know, Code Pink have launched this Ahava campaign. That's because Ahava is actually made in a settlement in the West Bank. They are owned also by 2 settlements, not fully owned. There are other investors there, such as the Disney family. It's not very well known. If you go to whoprofits.org, you will find all that interesting information listed there. So it's a settlement product. It's a product of criminal activity. It's very clear. What other settlement products are sold over here? You know, you don't get to say that. SodaStream, exactly. SodaStream. SodaStream, this is like home carbonating machine that makes soda at home. And they're going on very strongly now into the US market. They have a US subsidiary and they went out on the US stock exchange. You know, this is their big expansion policy. They have this little tag that says earth friendly because, you know, you don't use all these bottles. But actually, their main production facility is in Ma'ale Adumim, which is a settlement. And this is on an area that was confiscated. In fact, it's the biggest land confiscation in the history of the West Bank. It practically cuts the West Bank in 2. And you can read our report about SodaStream online on Who Profits to hear more about their labor practices and so on. So it's a good way to educate people about the occupation because this is something sold here. This is something that people might have in their own household. This is a good way to educate them. I'm jumping ahead. The famous campaign of the movement is the Veolia campaign. Have you heard about Veolia? No. It's a French company. You probably have, many people who are not familiar with the movement haven't heard of it. What they do is privatize public businesses, public services, such as public transportation, energy, water, wastewater, and landfills and so on. They privatize public services, and therefore the unions usually don't like them because they also de-unionize people. And they have a lot of business in the US. One good website to go to, I'll put it on the slide, is the Global Exchange website where we put up all sorts of tools. For example, a map of different Veolia contracts around the US. But why are they targeted? This is actually the flagship campaign of BDS. This is the first campaign, the first victory we ever had was already in 2006. It's the biggest campaign. It's our flagship. You know, we want more like these because it is such a good campaign. This company sells services to local communities, so you can organize locally. In the settlements, they do exactly the same thing. They operate buses. This is a bus line that goes to the settlements on Israeli-only road. You know, only picking up passengers in the settlements and bringing them back and forth into Israel proper, 48, whatever you want to call it. So it's a segregated bus. The Palestinians don't even get to sit in the back of the bus. You know, they just don't get to the bus. They also operate the Jerusalem Light Rail, which is an infrastructure project that does very much the same thing. It connects Jerusalem with the settlements in East Jerusalem. And the third thing is that they operate a landfill, a huge landfill called Tovlan, in the occupied area of the West Bank of the Jordan Valley, where Israel dumps its own waste. Waste from Tel Aviv and its suburbs goes all the way to the Jordan Valley, to the occupied area, and being dumped there. I can show you the documentations why the waste goes there, and I can prove it to you.
There is a waste dump there. I'm just saying that
No, the waste from inside Israel goes there. We can prove.
Some of it, but it's not true to say that
Some of it.
the metropolitan area goes to Ramat.
Some of it goes to the Tovlan site. And that's illegal according to international law. You cannot use the natural resources of an occupied area for your own economic gain.
I'm not arguing that. I'm just saying that saying something like, we take our dump and dump it at the West Bank, that's not true.
But it is true. Not all of it, but it is true.
But it's not. Well, maybe 2%, 3%. I mean, just saying that this saying is very inaccurate.
Okay, let me make it clearer. I'm sorry if I was misunderstood. Not all of the waste from within Israel goes to Tovlan. Of course, Tovlan cannot hold that. It's one of the bigger sites, but it's not the biggest one. Ramat Chovav is bigger. Even though they're going to close it down soon, it's full. Still, there is a lot of waste for, I don't remember the numbers, but there's 6 or 7 municipalities that on a regular basis send their waste to the Tovlan site. Now, even if they didn't,
300 municipalities in Israel.
even if it is a little thing, it's absolutely illegal. Now, even if we didn't have Israeli municipalities sending their waste to the occupied area, having that dump or that landfill in the occupied area under Israeli company, because it's the Israeli subsidiary of Veolia that operates it, paying taxes to the Israeli government by using the natural resources of the land there is already internationally, illegal. So these are two things. So they were really targeted all around the world. What people did was to check if their municipality or their county or their state or their, had a contract with Veolia. And if they didn't, what they did was to pass a resolution saying, we are Veolia free. So the city of Oslo passed such a resolution, for example, and Galway in Scotland have passed such a resolution. If they had a contract that was up for renewal, they were trying to lobby to get the contract not renewed because the company is involved with these crimes in Palestine. The idea is to put pressure on the company until it decided to change its policies and to step out of this involvement in Palestine. And it is estimated that the company lost over $10 billion in contracts around the world. The biggest one was the Stockholm Underground that they have been operating for 10 years up until that moment. There are several Veolia campaigns also in the US all around us. And Veolia is actually on the run. They are trying to, they were trying to move out of the operation of the light rail in Jerusalem, but no other transnational wanted this contract. It's a very problematic contract. So in itself, this is already a victory because it means that people should actually start looking at that international law, even if the International Court of Justice doesn't have jurisdiction because Israel is not a signatory to the International Court of Justice. And another company that was targeted was Motorola, Elbit Systems. I can tell you more about them if you ask me later, but I want to leave some time, little bit time for Q&A. Caterpillar, I'm sure you've heard about Caterpillar. The company that makes these huge bulldozers, and one of them was used to kill the American peace activist Rachel Corrie in Rafah. The thing about Caterpillar, this is like the oldest campaign in the US. It started actually before the BDS call. A call for Caterpillar as an American company to withdraw its involvement in the occupation. Caterpillar, I'll just say a word about them because it's such an old campaign. Caterpillar is selling bulldozers in 2 different ways to Israel. One is to the general pool of the civil construction, civil engineering in Israel, which is sold through their representative in Europe. And there is a completely separate line of supply that goes straight from the US, under the US military aid to Israel, to the Israeli army. So the company is very much aware of the fact that they are selling specifically bulldozers for the Israeli army. And the Israeli army has developed a modus operandi of urban warfare. They even wrote papers about it, of how to go into a very densely populated urban hostile area with huge fortified, armored D9s that have a gunner's position. They actually look more like tanks than like bulldozers, and just go into the city, take down houses, many times upon their inhabitants. The modus operandi goes like that. If there is a wanted person in the house, you send in a warning, you say the person has to come out or else, and then if they don't come out, you can use the bulldozers to try and shake the walls a little bit, and then you take the house down. In another situation, for example, in the invasion of Gaza or the invasion of South Lebanon, one of the platoons that was like leading the invasion was a line of unmanned bulldozers, remote controlled bulldozers, D9s. That what they did, again, they were like clearing the area for the troops from these very dangerous little streets. In many of these cases, and we have many such reports from human rights organizations, people couldn't leave their house on time. If they were elderly, if they were looking for the picture book or something, or for the cat, or if they were disabled, couldn't leave the house on time, and people were buried under the rubble. So the ask from Caterpillar is stop supplying these bulldozers to the Israeli army. HP?
They stopped supplying?
No, that's what we asked them to do, to stop. Another such company, that's the last one, I keep saying that's the last one, is Hewlett-Packard. Hewlett-Packard, you've heard of it? One of the things that they supply, people don't know that, but most of their business now is about surveillance and controlling big populations and identification systems and so on. So also in Israel, they supply this system to checkpoints operated by the Israeli army, which is called the Basel system, which is biometric identification for the checkpoints. So they participate in the system of checkpoints. They participate in the system of granting and denying special movement privileges to Palestinians, which is many times a form of control over the population, granting special privileges and denying them. And they also help maintain this huge database of biometric data of Palestinians who ever applied for this magnetic card permit. So they ask from HP, this is small business for you. Why do you need to be involved in something so controversial, something that, according to the World Bank, has destroyed the Palestinian economy, checkpoints? Please pull out of that business. One campaign that targets all of these companies, Veolia, Caterpillar, Motorola, HP, is the TIA-CREF campaign. And in order to learn more about that campaign, I invite you to go to WeDivest.org. That's the website. It's a really very clever campaign, because all it asks you to do is to sign a petition asking one of the biggest financial services companies in the US, TIA-CREF, to divest from these companies, to divest from the occupation. So, but the idea is that this is a financial services company that gives pension funds to many progressive organizations, such as schools and health institutions. National Public Radio, even better. Churches. So this is a place where people care about where they are invested. And even if they choose to invest in a socially responsible fund, as part of TIA-CREF, you can choose. Their logo is Financial Services for the Greater Good. So they really pride themselves on the idea of greater good. They have socially responsible funds within their investment options. Even in the socially responsible fund, you are still invested in some of these companies, like Motorola Solutions and Hewlett-Packard. So we are asking TIA-CREF to divest from the occupation, or at least to offer an alternative for people who do not want to be invested in their pension funds in the occupation. To offer a real socially responsible investment option for people. We also have the churches, the Presbyterian Church and the Methodist Church, that this year are coming to a vote about divestment in the pension, in the church funds from three companies: Motorola Solutions, Caterpillar, and Hewlett-Packard, three of these companies. And in both of these cases, people in the church have been working for years to try and engage with the companies and ask them to actually tell us more about your involvement, tell us maybe we can, influence your policies and so on. And this is the end of this process, where they have decided that the engagement doesn't work. And so the only thing remains is to pool the church investment, because both of these churches, these are huge churches, are very much committed to an end to the occupation and peace, and they don't want to be invested in things they don't agree with. And that's it. So what I'll do now, we'll do some Q&A. I'll pass around you this make-do kind of sign-up sheet, because I forgot my very nicely made, beautiful one in my suitcase, unfortunately. But this is if you want to continue receiving emails or information or anything like that from this project in Global Exchange, which is the name of the organization in the Bay Area, which is called EAP, Economic Activism for Palestine. So what we try and do, and you can go on the website and look at it, we try and provide more tools for activists over here to use this information in order to launch local campaigns. So the idea is that it's not enough for you to know that Veolia is doing these things in Palestine. You really want to know what Veolia is doing over here. Yes, that's the idea. Or HP, it's fine to know that they are working in the checkpoints in Palestine. But it's really interesting to know what is their business with ICE and immigration control in this country where they also sell similar systems. So that are the kind of things that we're trying to find out over there.
You've been listening to Israeli scholar, feminist, and activist Dalit Baum talking about the boycott-divestment-sanctions strategies for bringing an end to the illegal Israeli occupation and for pressuring companies to end their involvement in crimes against the Palestinian people. She is co-founder of the website Who Profits from the Occupation. In a moment, we'll return to the question and answer session from the presentation. To find out more about this work, please visit whoprofits.org, a website dedicated to exposing the commercial involvement of companies in continuing Israeli control over Palestinian and Syrian land. You can learn about specific campaigns by visiting the Global Exchange Economic Activist for Palestine webpage at globalexchange.org/EAP. To find out more about local campaigns in Portland, Oregon, please visit the Americans United for Palestinian Human Rights website at auphr.org. And now we return to the question and answer session from the presentation. Dalit Baum spoke at the Portland State University campus in Portland, Oregon on April 12, 2012. The first member of the audience with a question observed that the argument that the occupation is not sustainable is familiar to many people in the United States who've argued that the military-industrial complex is not sustainable, and that the prison-industrial complex is not sustainable, that capitalism itself is not sustainable. But of course, what it overlooks is that while it may be true that it's not sustainable for the broader population, for the 99% or more of the people in this country, it's seen as very sustainable for the few people who are profiting from these aspects of our society. Does the speaker think that the situation is the same in Israel, or are there fundamental differences between the U.S. and Israel as far as these different interests are concerned?
What does it mean sustainable? Nothing is sustainable, everything is in flux. But when people say that the occupation is sustainable, what they mean is that they want to go beyond the old negotiations about autonomy for Palestinians that will be more like a state or independent state, and to continue some form of control, economic control, but also control of the borders and control of the economic border, as they have right now, over the Palestinians in the occupied territory. And it's heard most clearly when you listen to the radical right in Israel. When you listen to the settler movement in Israel, they have some very interesting ideas coming out of the settler movement recently. For example, they all this buzz about the one-state solution. But one of the things that I've heard very prominent speakers on the right in Israel, some of them are even like the speaker of the Knesset in Israel. So it's not really very extreme, it's very mainstream, is that giving away any piece of the West Bank to any kind of a real sovereignty to Palestinians would mean that this area will be closed for further Israeli settlement and expansion, and this area will be open for return of Palestinian refugees. And they think this is a big deal. This is a threat to the balance of power, to their idea of what this thing should look like. So the idea is to continue and control this entire area, but to make it sustainable for the long run. And actually, it's a very elaborate idea. I mean, there are all these systems that are in place in order to make it so. Some claim that even the Oslo Accords were part of that, because much of the subsistence of Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza is taken off the Israeli budget. Israelis don't have to pay for it anymore. It comes from the donor states and the quartet, and so that's one form of subsidy for the occupation. For the ongoing control in different ways. I don't know if you want to call it occupation. People argue about the terms too, but the ongoing total control of the land and its people. And so there are all these discussions about how to make it more sustainable and still control everything. And in these discussions, our role would be to try and explain why it is not that sustainable. I even saw speakers on the right from the Yesha Council of the settlers movement saying, well, we don't want to, we want to annex the West Bank because this is historical land of Israel, blah, blah, but we cannot do that without giving civil rights to Palestinians because the world will see that as clearly a form of apartheid and Israel will be isolated and we cannot sustain that. So you see that inside the discussion already. There is a clear discussion here that takes into account international pressure that might be too hard for us to sustain. So I'm saying this is important. We need that international pressure because that international pressure already influences what people think can or cannot be done.
The next member of the audience observed that there are a lot of people at this event who have been very involved in the local campaign that targets Portland-based grocery chain New Seasons. They've done teach-ins and flash mobs and leafleting and petition campaigns with the goal of persuading the chain to discontinue carrying Israeli products. Although there has been a great deal of success in reaching out and educating the community, this member of the audience said that she believed that the campaign might have reached a point where it has become counterproductive. In response to the campaign, the local Jewish Federation started a Buy Israel campaign and a Buy Israel Day, also targeting New Seasons. The result is that the store now stocks even more products from Israel. Is there a point where the organizers need to reassess and rethink the direction of this campaign and consider other approaches to local BDS efforts?
That might be the topic of a much wider discussion with the group that is working on this. But my quick reaction is, usually my inclination as an activist is very practical. So we try to set smart goals, smart, strategic, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time constrictive or something like that. We try to set smart goals and then we try to achieve our goals. It's a big challenge, I think, for our movement, the Palestine Solidarity Movement or the Justice in Palestine or the Free Palestine Movement, whatever you want to call it, to move into BDS. Because it asks us to do a huge shift in the way we do things. BDS campaigns are actually lobbying campaigns. We're trying to change policy of our local grocery store. This is not the type of things we've done before. We were talking high politics. We were trying to do high education, using big values. It also asks us to think of ourselves differently, to change the view of ourselves as a movement. Because for many years, the movement was comprised of people who cared deeply about Israel-Palestine, who have been there, who have kind of encountered it on a very personal level, and feel like alienated from what they see on the news and try and educate others about it. And it's a kind of a very isolated position. You work from the margins and people think of it as something very depressing sometimes because things are getting worse and worse and worse. And some of your friends say, don't tell me anything about it. I know it's terrible. I don't want to hear, I don't want to hear about it. And sometimes when they come to your events, they actually want to be shocked. Shock me. Tell me how terrible it is. Show me dying children. It's crazy. And people are already also jaded, so they've seen everything. How do you shock them now? Let's tell them about water. Water is terrible. it's a very different mode to try and change the policy of some board of directors somewhere. Or you have to do lobbying, you have to do old style politics, which is very mainstream politics. You have to speak with people who do not agree with you and usually do not support BDS. And it doesn't make sense to get them to support BDS in order to support your campaign. It should be the other way around. They should join your campaign because it makes sense to them. And through that, you will tell them, this is BDS, actually. Everything you were told about BDS is wrong. This is BDS. That's the way it should happen. You should tell them, this bus you take to work is operated by a company that operates segregated buses. We don't want segregation in our community. The person doesn't know anything about Israel-Palestine. But now they want to know more. So it's a huge shift, and we should think of ourselves as being in a learning period right now. We are trying to teach ourselves how to use these tools because we know that these tools are not going to be effective one day. They are already effective. This is what works. This is where we can affect things. But affecting things is kind of thinking of ourselves as being able to affect things. That's another shift in our view of ourselves, becoming a successful movement. It's huge. Veolia lost another contract in London 2 months ago. We can celebrate. And when do we ever get to celebrate in this movement? So that's another shift. So what I'm suggesting is that think of it as a trial period when you are trying different things and see what works and what doesn't work. Also that's my personal preference. Try and do things that work. Try and think if you have a chance. I mean, you're trying to change this board's decision. What kind of leverage do I have on this board? Why would they listen to me? Just because, it's economic decisions. You have to have some leverage. Look around you. I think many of the co-op campaigns after the Olympia co-op boycotts failed. Personally, I also have a thing with going after Israeli products because there aren't that many of them. Kind of a dead end. And I think that Europe is the main export market for Israel for such consumer goods such as food. But most of the money comes from here. So I believe that the future of the movement from the US is a divestment movement, just like with South Africa. So people many times look for the grape. Where is our grape boycott? We want the grape boycott. And they ask me, what is a good... I don't have answers to them. I'm telling them, don't think grape boycott. No. Think South Africa. Okay? So divestment is complicated. Even understanding the term is complicated. And how to do that is complicated. We need to teach ourselves. That's why I really recommend the TIACREF campaign, because I think it's an easy way to start educating people about, I do care where my money is invested for my pension, So it's building a network of pension, of divestment movements for the future. As for consumer boycotts, they are very useful because they are very easy. They are very accessible. Somebody asks, what do I need to do? What do you divest from the occupation? What do I know? Sign that petition, they understand. But what to buy, what not to buy, it's very easy, it's very accessible. That's why it's so appealing to people to look for consumer boycott campaigns. But I don't think we have such easy answers when it comes to very good targets for boycotts that say, this is a criminal product and let me tell you about it so you will learn through it about the occupation and exploitation. We can do a lot of that in Europe. There are many such products. Here, whatever I know, I think I told you. So I want us to think of it as a long process, that one of the goals in it is building movement and educating ourselves. So maybe thinking of ways to allow ourselves with other issues and other groups in the area in a way that will help us launch other campaigns later. Maybe I was speaking earlier with Peter and others about this campaign. I said, maybe, I don't know the situation, but maybe ask the company to do something easier, something that they can do, and others will actually support them doing, like announce a better sourcing policy for their products that takes into account conflict zones and wars. Something like that others might, starting to build something that will create more awareness in your community of your concerns. And also build movement around it. And sometimes campaigns just don't work. So I'm not saying throw in the keys and say, we lost and go home. It doesn't matter because I believe that more and more people will join us, and it will become clearer to people what we're trying to do. But put it on hold. Do something else. We have very limited capacity also. We cannot boycott everything and divest from everything. We have to focus on some of the main goals of the movement, because this is actually trying to build a global network of campaigns that put pressure in the same places in order to be effective. So sometimes you can find a good local campaign, such as a local store, and build your local movement around it. And sometimes it doesn't work. So even doing something simple like sending a letter to Hewlett-Packard from people who work in your organization that says, we're very concerned with your policy and we will stop buying your ink. We're not calling for a boycott of Hewlett-Packard. It's too big and it doesn't make sense. Boycott is not the automatic action. It's like a strike. You use it as a threat. And as long as you don't have the masses, you cannot really threaten Hewlett-Packard with a boycott. But you can do different things to start building awareness around you that there is a problem with this company. And that will create the setting of the infrastructure of what we need in the next phase in order to actually challenge this company and tell them, we are a problem for you. You have to deal with us. You have to respond to our letters. So think of it like small things that you can do locally that will help you build movement and help these campaigns grow and become more effective. Yeah.
The next member of the audience observed that the Ahava campaign has received a lot of publicity. What have been the results of that campaign?
You see, that's a very good question, actually. What do we want from Ahava? Nothing. We don't want anything from them. Unlike Hewlett-Packard, we want something specific from Hewlett-Packard. We want them to pull out of this project with this and that, with biometric identification systems. What do we want from Ahava? Ahava is owned by settlements. It is in settlements. They're not going to move. So the goals in that campaign are very different than the goals in this campaign. Usually the goals are educational, telling people, here, there's this product here, let me tell you where it comes from, and through that I will tell you about. Some of the cases, I think activists have challenged the chains like Bed Bath & Beyond, asking them to deshelve Ahava. So it's asking them not to sell this product and not to participate. So the ask is from a store. We're not asking the company for anything. What do you ask? It's a different type of campaign. I think it's more open-ended in a way, because this product is not going anywhere. We're just using it in order to educate people about the occupation, the terms of production in settlements and so on. Exploitation of natural resources. Ahava also uses mud from the occupied area when they sell mud in packages. This is mud excavated in the occupied West Bank. They're not supposed to do that. I think you were first, and then you too. Yes.
The next member of the audience observed that the market for gluten-free foods has grown in recent years, and that Israeli products have been a large part of this market. She said that recently there have been products that emphasize the fact that they are made in the United States, and that folks who require these gluten-free foods now have more choices beyond the Israeli products.
Okay, let me try and do a parallel remark to yours. You're an American citizen.
Yes.
You already contribute to the occupation.
Well, I know.
Yeah,
I
okay.
want to contribute more.
Yeah, but you already are. There is no clean hands here. Mm-hmm. And the idea that people can distance themselves from these crimes that they don't believe in by choosing what they buy or not is not enough for us. That's good, but it's not enough for us. Because this is a decision made in the individual level. What you buy, what makes you feel good about what you buy, what kind of food you like. Yeah. That's an individual decision. The call for BDS is a call for collective action. Now, when it comes to collective action, you can continue making your own decisions of what you buy and what you not.
Well, I'm not going to buy a Caterpillar.
No, please don't. It's very expensive. Then the call is more than just making your own purchasing decisions.
Well,
Wait, let me say something. For example, if you have a computer, if it's a PC, most chances are that the chips were made, by Intel, and Intel have one of their biggest R&D centers in Israel. So you won't have a computer. you cannot, I think that BDS is actually asking us to do the opposite of distancing ourselves. Instead of saying, I don't want to do anything with that. I don't want to touch that. I don't believe in that. I won't buy it and I won't invest in it and you keep denying yourself of all sorts of things like a computer. The ask is actually for a collective action. So it says, let's check where are we invested in this. Let's check where are we contributing in this in a way that we can influence, because with your taxes you can do very little, just like you're saying. And then try and understand collectively and think strategically, where can we actually make a difference? Make a dent. So if you don't buy an HP computer, it doesn't mean that HP will even feel it. If all of us won't buy an HP computer, they won't feel it. We are too small for that. But what can we do in order to get HP to actually notice us? That's much more interesting than the computer. People, when I give this talk in universities, they said, I have an HP laptop and I love it. What am I going to do with it? And I said, well, use it. Do research about the occupation, do research for divestment. Now you have to. Guilt is a very powerful motivating force. As you can see, I'm Jewish. So, so I'm not telling people what to buy and not to buy. And if for some reason they have to buy the awesome gluten-free products, go for it, enjoy.
Well, I'm just saying the message is already out there because somebody is marketing something as a USA product in a way that I'm not seeing on any other product. And
they're probably afraid of these boycotts. That's why they're doing this labeling thing. But then the question is, do we want to pursue and advocate such a boycott? Is this a good target for people who need that? Maybe not. Maybe it's a good individual decision, but not a good target for boycotts.
It's a thing to talk about.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm a member of that particular community, and it's a thing I can talk about with people in that community.
But whatever makes sense locally and can be effective collectively. Yeah. Yes.
The next member of the audience, who identified herself as Jewish, said that she was having some visceral reactions to some of what has been said so far. She appreciated the information provided by the speaker, but that there were a couple things that had raised questions for her. The first question was what happened to the secular liberal support for the movements that the speaker was a part of in Israel. She said she felt that this message really should be targeting Israelis. The reason that the speaker is here in the United States doing this presentation is that Israelis are no longer receptive to this kind of message.
Okay, let me try and, this is my fault, because sometimes we use kind of insider lingo, and I didn't think to explain it because I was trying to rush to the next, and that's a problem. I was not really talking about secular support for the BDS movement. But I wasn't talking about secular support at all. When I said liberal, I was actually referring to this separation between liberal and radical, and thinking of the liberals as I think of them as merits. If you know the Israeli political landscape. Maybe. People who really speak about democracy and equality, and rights, and care about these issues. There are many, but they're not because they are secular, because they are liberal. It's the liberal line of historical thought. So I think that stream, that brand of Zionism has taken a huge beating in the last few years. And as you can see in the Israeli political map, they have very little representation in the Knesset. They have very little following in the mainstream discussion. And I'm saying this is a great loss for us.
I agree.
That's what I'm saying. That's what I meant. Now, as for BDS does not aim to punish Israelis or to harm Israelis. I actually think that going after corporations, the big corporations that profit from the occupation, is not going to harm Israelis. And it's not even, by the way, economically speaking, it's not even going to harm the settlements. Most of this, I gave you a very, 2 or 3 examples of victories. I can give you more. We had a lot of victories in the last 3-4 years. All of them were symbolic victories, because that's the kind of action we're doing. We're not trying to do something else. This is what we're doing. The effect is a symbolic effect that sends a message that says, this might have a price, change your ways. And in many times when you have such campaigns with corporations, we call them corporate accountability campaigns, like targeting Nike for their labor policies in the Far East or something like that. And when you target such a company, you're trying to change their policies. You're trying to tell them, hey, you need us. You need us as your consumers. You need us as your investors. You have to listen to our concerns. We can stop buying your products. We can associate your products with a bad label. That's how you need us. But it doesn't mean that I hate Nike. It means that I'm trying to help Nike transform its policies.
This same member of the audience said that she felt that the intentions of the BDS campaign are being misinterpreted. She said she grew up in New York and that her best friend growing up was Palestinian, that they drove to school together, and so she saw both sides of this conflict. She added that her father was nearly killed in the 9/11 attacks and that her temple in the Bronx had been bombed. The point being, she said, that when she heard about the boycott, she went out and bought every Israeli product off the shelves. She said that in Portland, Oregon, the Jewish community is very isolated. There's almost nothing. She said that she felt that earlier comments about a New Seasons ad that mentioned a Jewish holiday, she felt that was discriminatory, that there would not be a single ad for items for Passover. She said that she believed that the intentions of the BDS campaign may be good, that the speaker's heart is in the right place, but that BDS is being misinterpreted, and, this member of the audience suggested, some of the allies in the BDS movement support a one-state solution. Many people in the BDS movement are using BDS as a means to destroy the Jewish state. When people talk about the occupation, some people mean the entire state of Israel.
I want to try and respond because, you said a lot of things. So I will just respond to two little things there. One is, you're right. There is a lot of misunderstanding and very defensive reaction from Jewish communities. We need to do a lot more outreach, a lot more education. And there are so many Jewish and Israeli activists that are in the movement and can help in that. On the other hand, it's not always only about what the Jews think or need. In this case, and the story of Israel-Palestine in this country was very much framed around Jewish needs and Jewish cares and Jewish... And this is actually about Palestinian needs and Palestinian liberation. And it's uncomfortable for Jews, and it is going to be uncomfortable for Jews because it's the Jewish state which is doing all these terrible things. So it's very uncomfortable. But this is something that people have to move through and process. And it shouldn't hold the movement back. The movement is about Palestinians. And the last thing, there are all these actually coordinated campaign of delegitimization of the BDS movement, which is very well funded, and a lot was written about that. And it always tries to and aims to show the BDS movement as 1, 2, 3, and we even have the policy papers that say that this is what we need to do in order to handle this threat. We have to show that these are Islamists and support Hamas. And I have been in this movement from its inception. In fact, working for Who Profits, which is the information center, have put me in touch with many of the main campaigns of the movement when I tried to supply them, as all others, with information about these companies. Maybe some of them are, horrible anti-Semites. I haven't met them. I just haven't met them. I'm telling you the truth. I've met a lot of people who care deeply about Palestine, about justice, about human rights. And when it comes to, and that's something I have to add because I kept talking about the movement, but I want to say something about myself. I myself think that many of the strong reactions that we have these days, not just to BDS, to any form of criticism of Israel, are very justified. When we have Zionists that respond to not just BDS is just one thing. Any kind of critique or activists coming on Monday, traveling to Palestine and going to say that they are going to the West Bank instead of lying as they usually do in order to get in and going to be denied access. And this is a big hoo-ha in Israel. What are we going to do with this threat? I think that the Israeli state and its spokespeople are dealing with that as an existential threat because it is. And it is an existential threat to Israel as it is today, but it is not an existential threat to people. I really do believe in democracy and equality. And to have a state, or 2 states, or 3 states, or 15 states, or no states, in this one country, Israel-Palestine, with 3 parliaments, with 5 parliaments, I don't care, but where everybody has the same rights, equally, the same political rights, the same collective rights, the same human rights. It's going to be such an earthquake, such a deep change in what we have now in Israel, that all of the institutions that are there in order to protect Jewish privilege are, of course, a threat. They are. Nobody wants to give up their privilege. It's not going to be easy. And this is a huge shift, and it's going to take a lot of time, and it's going to take a lot of pressure from the outside in order for it to happen. It will not happen from within. It never happens from within. You know, people don't just say, oh, it's unjust, let's stop it, and now live as equals with our Palestinian friends and have Palestinians that govern our lives for sometimes when we govern their lives. You know, it won't happen. And I truly do believe in the right of return as an inalienable right of the Palestinian people. My ancestors have fled Poland prior to World War II because, you know, some of their families were left behind in the Holocaust and blah, blah, blah. But today I can go to Poland and receive my Polish citizenship. I don't want it, but it can happen. Wait, I'm giving you my view for a second. I am not an Arab. You know, my family comes from Eastern Europe, from Poland. And they can go, and this is what happens. People flee in times of war, but that doesn't mean that they have forfeited all rights and can become people without a state and without any rights forever and ever and ever and ever. Doesn't happen. There are basic tenets of what's just. And I don't think that it is such a terrible thing for me to live in my country with my Palestinian cousins in equality. And, you know, people do it everywhere.
You've been listening to Israeli scholar, feminist, activist, and co-founder of the website Who Profits from the Occupation, Dalit Baum, talking about boycott-divestment-sanctions strategies for bringing an end to the Israeli occupation. To find out more about the work of Who Profits, please visit whoprofits.org. To find out more about the local BDS campaign in Portland, Oregon, please visit the Americans United for Palestinian Human Rights website at auphr.org. This program was produced by PDX Justice Media Productions of Portland, Oregon. To find out more about our work and to access our growing library of free on-demand streaming video and audio programs, please visit our website at pdxjustice.org. And write to us with your comments and questions at pdxjustice@riseup.net. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks for tuning in, and thanks for supporting listener-sponsored radio, public access cable television, net neutrality, independent bookstores, and all forms of grassroots, democratic, community media.
Much disturbed by evidence of human rights violations in the West Bank. They were very much torn by the facts on the ground of what it means to hold 3.5 million people under a military occupation. What does it mean in the daily meanings of that? And so for us in the radical left or the anti-occupation movement or whatever, they were our natural audience. They were also our protective blanket because there was this very widespread idea that Israel is a democracy and should be a democracy, which usually means in the Israeli public sphere that there are a lot of civil liberties to people who come from where I come from, to Israeli Jews, Ashkenazi Jews, mainly from the center of the country, there are things that I can do that a Mizrahi activist cannot do. It's not by law, it's just something very similar to what you have in this country when you compare people of different ethnicities and their ways of dealing with the state or what they cannot do. And when it came to Palestinians in the occupied territories, they are kind of on the last rung of this ladder, and they have no rights at all, no civil rights whatsoever. You cannot demonstrate. There is no legal demonstration in the West Bank. So that's why I'm saying that the liberal Zionists were kind of our protective blanket, because they didn't want to see people who look like them being attacked by the state with some repressive measures. So the idea of freedom of speech and freedom of press and freedom of association and all of these freedoms were more or less what kept us going in the public sphere in Israel, even when we were not very popular, while as our allies who were not white or not in the center or even worse, Palestinian, did not enjoy the same freedoms. And that was okay. Now, we have lost that centrist, liberal, Zionist a group of people. It's not because they have disappeared. They're still there, and I know them, and they're doing well. It's just that in the Israeli political sphere, there is very little space that remains for them. The parties that represented them have shrunk to almost nothingness. They were considered irrelevant after the breakdown of the Oslo Accord. There were all these crises that happened that made them disappear from the mainstream political sphere. And that also influenced the movement on our side, because and then there are the darker parts, which are urban areas, and the blue patches, which are Israeli settlements, Israeli population living in the West Bank, which is in an area which is not considered even by Israel to be part of the state of Israel. Israel has not annexed it. It is under military rule, and the sovereign in this part is the Israeli military. So as you can see, the map is very elaborate and intricate, and I'm sure you've seen it and heard about it before. I'm going to assume it today. But this is the map, which is a geographical map that also has economic implications. And we will try also to read the economic implications of such a map, which is so intricate today. So where does it start for me? For me, I've been involved in the movement since the 1990s, but the turning point, I think, for me and for many others in my generation, in my movement, the anti-occupation movement, in my case also the feminist anti-occupation movement or the women's peace movement, we had all these names throughout our existence. The turning point was with the anti-wall campaign. Israel has started building a wall in the West Bank in 2003. And when the wall started being built, we didn't know where it was going to be. There were no official maps, there were no public maps. We just heard from people along the route of the wall that their land is being confiscated, that the wall was being built and separating them from the next village, not where we thought it was going to be built. It was very odd, and we didn't know what to make of it. And very quickly, in 2003, sprang from out of nowhere, from these villages along the route of the wall, the anti-wall movement. Okay, we hear a lot of anti-wall movements. It's the anti-wall, W-A-L-L. And the anti-wall movement had several characteristics that remained with it until today, and it keeps on going until today. One of the characteristics is very grassroots oriented. It's very much non-partisan, which is extraordinary in the Palestinian political map. If you know a little bit about it, it's quite extraordinary. Another thing is that they have embraced non-violence, even in the Gandhian sense. In some cases, even the Gandhian sense. And these days, there is I think the 5th Bil'in non-violence conference in Bil'in, which is one of these villages that has been protesting regularly against the wall being built on their land. This is one of the first villages that protested Bidu. So this is my proof that I was there. And as you might know, this is some Welcome. Thank you, everybody. I'm really glad to be here. It's such a beautiful day, and we have a big agenda for today. I don't know how much of it we'll manage to do within the less than 1 hour in which I want to talk to you. I want to tell you some about the work we've been doing in Israel. I'm an Israeli. I've been an activist in the Israeli peace movement, or peace and justice movement, or anti-occupation movement, or democracy movement, whatever you want to call it. And I want to tell you a little bit about this project, Who Profits from the Occupation, and our research and the results of that research, and who really profits from the occupation. You know, it's a question, so I want to give you some answers. And I also want to tell you about some of the campaigns that sprung out of this attempt to look for the profiteers, some campaigns around the world, and where did they lead and what did they result in. So you'll have some kind of an idea of this global movement that has sprung in the last 3 or 4 years. And we've been hearing about it. This is a movement that's called the Boycott-Divestment-Sanctions movement, BDS, Boycott-Divestment-Sanctions. So it's a lot. And I will just start chronologically, telling you a little bit about how I got to be doing this work. And whatever I won't manage to cover now, you can ask me about later. We'll have time for Q&A, if that's okay with you. So Israel-Palestine. This is a map of Israel-Palestine. It's one country. It has 2 names. It's a very, very common misconception. This is an enlarged map of the West Bank, which is here. And most of the time today I will be talking about the West Bank, for the obvious reason that as an Israeli I cannot even go into Gaza. It's completely closed to Israelis. So almost all of the research we have done was done in the West Bank. And if you look at this map, you see these yellow-brown patches. These are Palestinian population centers, approximation of some part of the wall. As you probably know, nonviolence is a code name for a lot of violence on one side over the other. And in these demonstrations, we had dozens of people who were killed, even though they were protesting nonviolently, peacefully. And you saw that picture of women with banners, but what happens next, I don't, you know, this is a talk I used to give in 2005, but this is like old news by now. Everybody have seen it, you have seen the videos, and if not, you should go online and look for them. These demonstrations they are faced with live fire, rubber-coated bullets, tear gas, and all sorts of other measures that are many times deadly. So this was a very quick school for us Israeli activists. For our generation, I think it was the first time that we were actually invited as allies to the Palestinian struggle. And we got this great opportunity and in fact, honor to be invited as allies and to stand with the Palestinians and see the scene for a moment from that direction, and facing our own army. You know, the same military that I grew up to see as my protectors, my friends, my family, myself. You know, it's a very crazy situation to see that. It also changed our idea of who we are and what we want to do. I think for many of us in this movement, until those years, we were still very much embedded in the idea that our role as Israeli activists was to change Israeli public opinion. So there was this global movement for justice in Palestine, and the Israelis in this movement, they have a specific role to change Israeli public opinion. Now, I still think that's the case. I believe in that. I just think this is really very hard because what was happening in the last few years, as any of you who read the news can see, is a drift to the right in the Israeli political arena and very overt racism and one of the most right-wing governments we've ever had. And it seems like the Israeli public opinion is actually drifting away from us very clearly. And another thing that happened is it seems that we have lost part of our natural audience. And our natural audience in Israel for many years was the liberal Zionist camp. The people who truly believed in liberal ideals of equality and democracy and a constitution and separation of church and state. And they were very much that our natural audience was no longer there. And our natural safety net was no longer there, which meant that we were more and more exposed to the same measures used by the state against Palestinians. Arbitrary interrogations by the the General Security Services, the Shabak. Arbitrary arrests and breaking into our offices to take computers. Things like that did happen before, but not as often, and not in the center of Tel Aviv, and not to people of white ethnicities. So that's probably what was going on for us, for people around me, between 2000 and 2007 or so. So that's part of the same process where we found ourselves actually being useful in this movement, even though this was not an Israeli movement, it was a Palestinian-led movement, where the internationals came as solidarity activists. We couldn't call ourselves solidarity activists. We are Israelis trying to change our own country. It's not really solidarity. It's a lot deeper than that. But still, it's not our movement. We cannot make decisions. We cannot lead this movement. It's a Palestinian movement. And we have all the privileges in this area, in the West Bank, that Palestinians do not have, like freedom of movement, which is a huge privilege, that make it easier for us to take over. So trying not to take over was also a very important lesson for us to learn. What does it mean to work with others and remember that this is not your movement, but still be there with all your political ideology and beliefs? How do you do that? What happens if there are conflicts? It's very, very complicated and interesting. Anyhow, this movement is a very appealing movement. If you haven't seen more about what people do in these different villages, you should just go online and go to any of the websites that cover this. Start with the anti-wall website, antiwall.org or something like that, and just see the immense creativity and power and energy in this movement. Every week you have 3, 4, 5 demonstrations. This is all in Bil'in, and they're all non-violent. They're always ending not so well, but they're always restarting again. And the repressive measures used by the state have escalated over the years, from shooting and killing demonstrators. Now it's also night raids and arbitrary arrests of kids from the villages where the demonstrations are being held in order to interrogate them. I'm sorry, I'm like digressing, but I think it's an important story. Once in a while we